Welcome to the Rodell Cast, where we discuss issues related to public education and the workforce with guests from around the state and around the world. This podcast is part of a series in an OECD project called Career Pathways in a Rapidly Changing World. We are looking at the transition from senior secondary school or high school to whatever young people decide to do next. We're looking specifically at high school programs that build meaningful work-based learning experiences into their general education courses to better prepare young people to make more informed choices later. Today's story is about Australia. Over 5 days, I spoke to about 40 students and 50 adults in Victoria and New South Wales, as well as read quite a bit. But in a country of 26 million people, what follows is just a snapshot in time, a slice in their story. We're going to hear from Tony Mackay, a global education expert in Melbourne, about why this moment feels special, and then we'll hear from Natalie Garcia de Heer in the Ministry of Education in Victoria, who's helping lead the change management process for this state of over 6 million people. Finally, we'll hear from a practitioner and some students about their experiences.
Hey, Paul. Hi.
So, Tony, thanks so much for everything you did to help me get the trip in Australia set up, as well as thinking about New Zealand and the conversations we had there, and sort of the lead up to it has been really enlightening. And so I wanted to get a little more context from you on this podcast so that we could set the stage for some of the conversations I had with some students and practitioners. Yep. So if you could just maybe explain who you are and really give us a sense of why I kept on hearing that this is a once-in-a-generation moment in Australia.
Well, Paul, it's been a delight to connect in Australia as we have connected over a number of years in the US. And given that we've got a shared commitment to what we might call pathways of young people as they move from one stage of learning to another, particularly, I guess, in the context that you've been exploring across multiple jurisdictions, the transition from the more senior years of high school or senior secondary through to the next stage of further learning, further study and work. We've both been deeply engaged in this conversation, and the fact that I think that there's a once in a generation, or certainly a moment in time, where this agenda is coming into sharp relief. And look, for those of us who have been involved in educational reform in various capacities, certainly my own engagement has been across research, policy and practice. I guess to narrow it down a little, I've been particularly committed to thinking about the way in which we can help young people who I think have been victims of a bifurcated system, a kind of false dichotomy between theory and practice, between head and hand. For many years, we've been attempting, as a number of jurisdictions globally, maybe those that are understood more deeply would include Singapore and Switzerland and Germany, but there's plenty of places in the US that deeply understand that we need to change the way in which we think about learning and not to separate knowledge and skills, to think carefully about the senior secondary years in particular, but of course that has knock-on implications for the whole of schooling, preschool through to the tertiary system that, of course, includes both universities and vocational education and training, technical and further education. I've been associated with that agenda at multiple levels, both national and, as you say, across a number of international settings. And I do feel that this is a particular moment. I mean, by the way, in some ways, Australia was part of early progress in this area. If you go back a couple of decades, people would come to Australia to look at the way in which we were tackling our vocational education and training.
Tony sees this as much more than a programmatic change in how we organize high schools. He sees this as a systemic shift with global implications, one that involves many stakeholders, most notably secondary education, higher education, and employers.
We are seeing a understanding that we need to shift the way in which we particularly do senior secondary education to open up multiple pathways for young people that will match their passions and their interests and give them a real sense of direction where they can make the kind of contribution they want to make. Not just about caring for themselves, but caring for others and caring for the planet. So I think there's a new learning agenda with a new narrative around purpose to match the new economy, if you like, to match the potential for technology to support us as human beings, and to match the demands that I think we have for us to be local and global citizens. I know I'm broadening the scope of the conversation, but I think if we don't place it in that larger context, then it's not clear as to why this is, as you say, once in a generation. It's once in a generation because if we don't get this right, then I think we're in trouble as a human species, just to state it as baldly as that.
Much of the major policy work on education in Australia and elsewhere is driven by large policy reviews with dozens of recommendations. Tony points out that these have been important in shifting the conversation and broadening the scope of change.
The big shifts that are taking place, and I'll just add one point. I could name half a dozen reviews that have been undertaken in the Australian context, New Zealand context, as you say, in Scotland, in Canadian provinces, in the US, just over the last few years. But I do think that those reports have been helpful in appreciating that we are talking about an integrated agenda. We're talking about from early years through to lifelong learning. And when you place this otherwise, in some people's minds, more narrow agenda around vocational education and training, around successful pathways, when you place it in the broader context, then you see the imperative. And that's why we're talking about a big shift. It's not just a little bit of nuancing. It's not just about Australia making sure that it plays in some of what Singapore does or Switzerland does or Germany or Delaware, right, or Illinois or wherever I can go. I can go to plenty of places and say they're doing great work across the entire vocational education and training area with remarkable, for example, new apprenticeship schemes that are quite incredible, empowering young people. I can go to all of those places and say, we'll just import some of that into a weaker system that we have at the moment. Well, yeah, we can do that, but it's bigger than that.
Natalie Garcia de Heer in the Department of Education in Victoria is charged with taking all the recommendations from one of those reviews and bringing them to life. She helps lead something I had not seen in the US or other countries, a dedicated team of 80 people called the Secondary School Reform Task Force that had a budget of 100 million Australian dollars per year for 5 years to implement a review by John Firth, the CEO of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Victoria. Natalie and her team were very generous in taking me to see several schools and to help me understand their strategy.
Over 2020, the Victorian government kind of commissioned a pretty extensive review of what we call vocational and applied learning pathways in senior secondary schooling, led by an illustrious gentleman named John Firth. And that review made a number of recommendations, 38 to be precise, about how we can improve quality, access, perceptions of vocational and applied learning in senior secondary and also before senior secondary. So the recommendations spanned questions around career education, vocational and applied learning pre-senior secondary, the senior secondary certificate structure that students can do in order to graduate from high school, VET delivered to secondary students, school-based apprenticeships. So there's a huge reform agenda set out by that review. And my part of the department was established in order to really drive the reform, so to give real an authentic effect to the outcomes of that work.
This is a comprehensive strategy which involves not only changing the work in the schools, but the qualifications associated with graduation. Previously, rather than a common diploma or qualification for all students, they had a multi-tiered system in which university-going students got one highly regarded degree, and those not going to university, those studying the trades, got a qualification of perceived lesser value. This set of reforms that began in 2020 changed that bifurcation, so all students finishing their secondary education would now get access to a work-based learning experience and a common certification or qualification known as the Victorian Certificate of Education. Those are big shifts. I asked Natalie what success would look like in 2025.
Maybe this is today's version and yesterday's might have been different, but I think every student has access to a high-quality work experience or work experience-like opportunity before senior secondary. That every student, maybe this is pretty ambitious, but can select a learning sequence or what we call a pathway aligned to their strengths and interests that combines vocational and applied and theoretical and all kinds of learning for senior secondary.
When I asked her whether the content of what students need to know and be able to do is changing, she had this to say.
I think we are in a world where the the type of skills and abilities and dispositions that students need finishing secondary is getting more and more demanding. And I think it's not really okay that a lot of students graduate having done learning that perhaps didn't necessarily emphasize those human, interactional, 21st century, whatever you want to call it, skills. So I think to some extent applied learning as a pedagogy is a kind of way of giving students better exposure to learning capabilities which are more relevant to the quote-unquote 21st century. But notwithstanding, we need really good mathematics and English as well. And I think that's the challenge. I think there's how do we prioritise different kinds of learning, and how do we swing resources in to support all students to be able to get all those kinds of learning.
We talked quite a bit about the change management process itself. Again, this is a state of over 6 million across a large geographic footprint. Natalie had this to say.
Sitting, I think, at the nexus of what is in Australia two separate systems, a school system and a kind of training skills and higher education system, making sure that our work is reflected in those systems and that we can orient them both towards similar outcomes is also a challenge. And that kind of manifests in how do we make sure that schools' workforce strategy considers the capabilities required to teach in an applied way, for example, or how do we make sure a kind of skills strategy for clean energy thinks about the role of careers education in schools.
I got a chance to visit several schools in Victoria and New South Wales, and here are some snapshots of how the students are experiencing this shift. For one student that was doing a traineeship or extended internship in a law firm, a takeaway was learning about simply being in an office.
If they said something that you don't necessarily like, or how to greet them differently, it's just also like with managers calling in sick and all, you don't just not show up like sport.
Right.
It's different, I guess it's dealing with people and how to do it professionally.
For some, even finding out what they didn't want to do was valuable.
I guess I'm not into law anymore. Maybe like after this experience, I was able to say I'm not into law. But in general, it was a really good experience, especially working with older people. In general, just adults, not like older, just adults. Right. It's different. It's a head start, I guess, in the workplace.
For another student, being in a traineeship in a physical therapy office gave her time to start thinking about her career.
I just think it's like, just in case you switch up like your path down the track, it's always good to have like either like a certificate or just some sort of like another, that like, for example, you did some traineeship here like a while back and then you thought about it and it's like, wow, that actually kind of like, I actually kind of enjoyed that. I can see like a future down that career. But it's like, I just think you got to be so open-minded and you got to like just make time for it.
For another student in the Girls Can Too program in New South Wales, a program dedicated to increasing gender diversity in the trades, getting a taste of diesel mechanics not only informed her career choice, but became an opportunity to realize she was a leader. Laura shared that she'd changed schools a few times, and this experience working in the diesel shop just came naturally to her. In what follows, you'll hear Laura and her guidance counselor.
I had no experience in any of it, but because I've come from a farm, you've seen the stuff. You've seen people do it as such, or you've talked about it. So then to go into soldering, it's just like, yeah, okay, this looks easy enough. And then using just knowledge, common sense.
I think you did have a bit of a leadership role in this program, although that was not intentional.
Yeah, it kind of was intentional from the crowd per se.
But I think from my perspective, that gave you a lot of confidence and you really grew because of that. So apart from, you being exposed to all these different trades and you've now sort of decided that you think you might like to be a diesel mechanic and all that sort of stuff, that's all great. But on top of that, I feel that you had lots of personal growth through the opportunities that it presented you, because you did end up, whether you like it or not, you were a leader of that program. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, like very natural leadership, like qualities.
For the vast majority of students I spoke with, the experience of getting out into a work placement was inspiring, or at minimum, gave them a sense of what they do and don't want to do. But having secondary students engage with employers can be challenging, particularly if those employers aren't ready to receive them. One young woman whose dad was a mechanic and had aspirations of running his shop one day got discouraged about the field when she was put in a work placement where she didn't feel welcome.
It was that day was good until it got to that point right at the end. Because I think that was the day I almost got to do stuff. Like, I'm not, like, because obviously my dad's a mechanic. I'm not registered or anything, but I know how to do things. Like, I know how to change tires. I know how to do oil, like car services. I walked in, I went to go get the parts, and he stopped me immediately and was like, "Oh, do you know what you're doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I know what I'm getting." And he was like, "Oh, okay, just show me what you've got, like, you know." And I was like, "Oh, I can't get it. Like, I know what I'm looking for." Yeah, and I was like, and he was like, no, let me help you. Like, I don't want you to mess it up. I was like, whatever. But that moment especially, I was like, I'm not going, this field I don't think is for me with other people. Because there was no women there.
There were other challenges. Transportation is one, especially before the students get their provisional license, or P as it's referred to there. A second is parent expectations, particularly parents who saw a work placement as counterproductive to their child potentially pursuing university. The guidance counselor in New South Wales shared the following.
And also kids looking at alternative pathways. Getting to work is always an issue. So until kids have their Ps, and then even then, most families aren't in the situation where they can buy their kid a car. But if they are in that situation, then that's great because the kid can then get themselves to work. If they don't have their Ps, most parents work. And so then getting, their young person to an apprenticeship or wherever is exceptionally difficult. Another barrier is parental expectations. So that's part of my role, is to advocate on behalf of students with their parents. And just educate parents about the amazing opportunities that are available in lots of different areas and the changing nature of work.
This was a fascinating visit, and a heartfelt thanks to all those in New South Wales and Victoria who helped put this together. And despite being hard, this really felt like a moment in Australia. So let me close this post with where we started, with Tony Mackay, and share his thoughts on the fact that this is not about tweaking around the edges.
Sure, you can have innovation. Sure, you can nuance things around the edges. Sure, you can make incremental improvement to the current system that we have. But the high-performing systems and those, quite frankly, who know that they've got huge challenges and looking for leapfrogs, I reckon they're clear that it's not just about doing something better or faster. It's about doing things differently. And that, to me, is more radical innovation. That equals, for me, transformation.
Thank you for listening to this podcast on Australia's work to reimagine its college and career preparation. Stay tuned for the next podcast on New Zealand's career pathway system. We'll be talking about what pathways look like in Auckland and Wellington from a student perspective, and we'll also be talking with some of the Maori leaders that are working to redesign for the future with equity at the center of the work. This episode was produced and edited by Alejandro Villamares and Matt Amos at Rodell and contains original music from Jesse Herdman. This larger project was done in cooperation with our team here at Rodell in Delaware and with the OECD team in Paris. None of this would have been possible without our many in-country partners in Australia, New Zealand, and Scotland, and the generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Rodell Foundation. That's it for this Rodell cast. I'm Paul Herdman. Thank you. Until next time.